Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jared Jackson. I work in literary programs at Penn America. I'm excited to welcome you to the first Penn Out Loud event of the winter season. Penn Out Loud is a year-round conversation series presented by Penn America and, of course, our wonderful host, the Strand bookstore, that amplifies diverse voices and convenes vital conversations with authors, poets, journalists, artists, and activists. We have a truly amazing program this season, and we hope to see you back here in 2 weeks for a conversation with best-selling author Mitchell S. Jackson and distinguished scholar Imani Perry. Tonight, we're here to celebrate the radical historical narrative Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman, who will be in conversation with Leslie Jamison. We'll have a short reading, a discussion, and then open the floor for a Q&A. Please use the mics for that portion of the segment. Books are available for purchase, and the signing will conclude the evening. Saidiya Hartman has published articles on slavery, history, and the archive, and Black women's lives. Along with Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, she's the author of Scenes of Subjection and Lose Your Mother. A MacArthur Genius Fellow, she has also been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Cullman Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar. She's a professor of English and Comparative Literature and Gender Studies at Columbia University. Leslie Jamison is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Recovering and the Empathy Exams, and the novel, The Gin Closet. Her most recent work is the essay collection, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. She is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, the Oxford American, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. She directs the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Saidiya Hartman and Leslie Jamison.
Such a pleasure to be here with you tonight.
It's great to be here. Thank all of you for coming out.
When Jared was putting together the idea for this, I told him that one of the reasons that I was excited to speak to you is not only that I've been an admirer of your work for such a long time, but because some of my students are here tonight, but I taught a lot of this book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, in my graduate seminar last semester focused on archival research, and so it felt like this incredible gift to be able to ask you some questions about not just the aims of the book, but also its methods and how, in a sense, the ethics of the book and its methodology feel impossible to talk about separately. Some of the things that moved me about the book, and then maybe if you would read a little bit to kick things off, but some of the things that moved me about this book were the ways in which it's interested in documenting the simultaneity of beauty and pain and how those things live together in lives, and really this question of how we deal with gaps in the historical narrative and when and how imagination can fill those gaps and when and how we leave those gaps standing. And these feel like pretty essential questions about how to live in the present as well. So it's wonderful to be here with you tonight.
It's great to be here. So should I start?
Maybe, yeah.
I'm looking forward to the discussion because you're right that there's a way that the book tries to enact a certain kind of ethical engagement with the archive and think about how we might narrate lives differently. So we can talk about that. So I'm going to read, anticipating all of that, I'm going to read a section of the book, and a lot of what I do is actually describe things that don't exist, but I wish they did. So I will describe one of those moments. Some things didn't appear in the photographs, like the 3 flower pots lined up on the windowsill, the crazy quilts covering the tick mattresses, the Bibles wrapped in lace and calico, the illustrations from the mail order catalog affixed to the walls. The reformers and the journalists were fixated on the kitchenette. They didn't know that the foyer, the fire escape, and the rooftop were a stretch of urban beach, not until the rich adopted the practice and sleeping on rooftops became fashionable. They didn't know that the hallway and the stairwell were places of assembly, a clearing inside the tenement, or that you love in doorways. There is no photograph of the hallway barely illuminated by a flickering gaslight that hides everything that is unlovely. Even in the daytime, the shadows are too dark and too deep to capture it. The hallway provides the refuge for the first tongue kiss, the place for hanging out with your friends, the conduit for gossip and intrigue. Here, you first learn about the world and the role to which you have been consigned, so you scribble fuck or wretched on the wall in the stairwell. The hallway is where the authorities post the tenement house laws and the project rules, and the guidelines might as well say, Negro, don't even try to live. It is inside but public. The police enter without warrants and arrest whoever has the bad fortune to be found and caught. It is the passageway that leads to the 2 rooms where you stay with your mother, father, aunt, and your 2 sisters. Your mother tries to make the drab rooms home by setting out your grandmother's tea set, which is too fancy for the small kitchen table. The set belonged to the white folks she worked for. She said it was a gift, but once let it slip that it was owed to her. She earned it and much more. A Masonic lodge calendar and lithograph of Frederick Douglass hide the crack on the plaster wall. The sheer curtain hanging in the window filters the weak light of late afternoon. The ivory table mat covering the battered stovetop confirms that even in the worst places, one finds beauty. All that effort makes it less terrible. No one forgets that they are here because excluded from everywhere else, so you make do and try to thrive in what's nearly unlivable. It is the black belt. You are confined here. You huddle here and make a life together. In the hallway, you wonder, will the world always be as narrow as this, 2 walls threatening to squeeze and crush you into nothingness? So you imagine other worlds, sometimes not even better, but at least different from this. You and your friends hatch plots of escape and dereliction. This black interior is a space for thought and action, for study and vandalism, for love and trouble. The hallway is the parlor for those who manage to live in cramped, dark rooms with not enough air and who see the sunlight only when they step out onto the front stoop. It is ugly and brutalizing, and it is where you stay. It doesn't matter if you don't love the place. You love the people residing there. It is as close to home as you'll get. It is a transient resting place, an impossible refuge for those forced out, pushed on, displaced always. They stay, but never settle. The hallway is a space uneasy with expectation and tense with the force of unmet desire. It is the liminal zone between the inside and the outside for the one who stays in the ghetto. The reformer documenting the habitat of the poor passes through without noticing it, failing to see what can be created in cramped space, if not an overture, a desecration, or to regard our beautiful flaws and terrible ornaments. This hallway never appears in the lantern slideshow. Only the ones who reside in the tenement know it. It won't be photographed from the inside until decades later. Not until 1953 will a photograph convey the experience of dwelling within these walls, offer a glimpse of the life worlds made there, capture the breathlessness of a 4th floor walk-up, know firsthand that how we live and where we stay is not a social problem. It is our relation to the white world that is the problem. Even in the kitchenette, one can find the joy of couples dancing under a clothesline suspended from the ceiling, teenagers playing cards and laughing with their friends, a man sitting at a kitchen table drinking tea, the steaming cup pressed tight against his cheek. He delights in the sensation of the heat against his face, the feel of the porcelain on his skin. The how to live and the fierce urgency of the now can be perceived in these other photographs, the images lost and found, imagined and anticipated, like stills edited from an unfinished movie, the tintypes taken at a church picnic, the Kodaks on the beach at Coney Island, images of two fast black girls trying to make a way out of no way, a serial picture of young black women rushing to the city to escape the plantation and intent on creating a free life in the context of a new enclosure. They are as desperate to find an escape route from servitude as they are hungry for new forms of life. Watching people stroll the avenue or play cards on the step or drink wine on the roof, they are convinced that Negroes are the most beautiful people, the communal luxury of the black metropolis, the wealth of just us. The black city within the city transforms the imagination of what you might want and who you might be, encouraging you to dream. Shit, it don't even matter if you're black and poor, because you are here and you are alive, and all these folks surrounding you encourage you and persuade you to believe that you are beautiful too. This collective endeavor to live free unfolds in the confines of the carceral landscape. They can see the wall being erected around the dark ghetto, but they still want to be ready for the good life, still want to get ready for freedom.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to hear that aloud. There's so many questions to ask from that, but one phrase that really stuck out to me hearing it this time was this hunger for new forms of life, and the way that many of the subjects in this book were hungry for new forms of life, but thinking about that also in relation to what you were saying at the very beginning about being interested in this book with figuring out or wrestling with new ways of documenting lives as well. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, just as a kind of framing. I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with the book, and maybe some people aren't yet. If you could talk a little bit about the lives that you were documenting in this book, and also a bit about some of those questions of how to represent a life, or what the search for a new way of representing lives might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the period I'm writing about is kind of murky. So, there's the Harlem Renaissance, but then everything between it and basically the end of Reconstruction is this period that is largely defined by, disappointment, the remaking of the racial order, but we have this narrative of the modern and the making of the modern that begins, in the aftermath of World War I. And I think that as I started to encounter these records, what I was confronting is like, oh, well, there were, people, working class, white and immigrant women, and young black women who were in the city trying to make the modern, trying to create new terms of existing. And, but like that story wasn't largely an available historical narrative. I mean, there's something about the emergence of the quote unquote new woman, but that's always about college educated elites. And we know when, students from like Harvard and Yale go to the ghetto, they discover, Jews and socialism and anarchy, but they're these people who are there just trying to make other ways of living and surviving. And so it's like, oh, how do I then try to tell that story? But since it's actually, it has an eventfulness to me, but it doesn't have an objective eventfulness in the world, how do I go about establishing that? I mean, I think early on, a reader said, well, these are just kind of like loose young women. What are really the stakes of the experiment that they were involved in? So I had to think about, in terms of describing their lives, giving the reader enough information so that the reader would be smart enough and know enough to understand how large and radical the stakes of their experiment were.
At one point in the book, I remember there was a phrase like talking about revolutions in bedrooms, or that sort of the mattering of what happens even in those closed spaces, and even the idea of closed spaces and how those spaces open on to something larger feels like this spatial recurrence, even in what you read, sort of here's where the interior opens onto an urban beach or opens onto an outdoors, but that also feels like part of the question of what happens in these private closed spaces also have a real resonance and an import that's much bigger as well.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's the strange thing, because I mean, you know, for the working class and the poor, and particularly for Black folks, it's not as if the private is bounded, that it has a kind of sovereignty, that it's impenetrable by the state or by the police. And I guess, you know, and the problem of the slum and the problem of the tenement is that people aren't living their private lives in a proper fashion. So there's something about the social promiscuity of that space, the way people live intimately together, so that the private is more of a kind of ideological construction, which for me is different than the intimate. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of what I recount is space, because I'm thinking about like, oh, how are people inhabiting space, and thinking about space, it's also how I'm, you know, building story. Like, what does it mean to, you know, to hang out in the shadowy recesses of a tenement hallway? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and it feels connected to what you were saying earlier about the ethical call and then the craft challenge, in a way of recognizing forms of eventfulness that don't look like standard narrative structures, right? And that space might be a way into that as well, like thinking about the spaces where things happen as opposed to the capital letter plot points of what happens. There's sort of more room for rhythms and recurrences, and when you're looking at things through that sort of spatial angle. I was struck, and this gets to what you were saying about sort of people going into the space of the slums and almost maybe seeing what their ideological agendas have like programmed them to see. But at a couple of moments in the passage that you read, it invokes like what the reformer sees and what the reformer doesn't see, or mm-hmm. what the reformer misses. And it seems like part of what's happening in that passage is seeing or imagining those very things that might escape and did escape the notice of the reformers, which also feels like part of the project of the book. On a larger level, like how were reformers calling some of the subjects of your book like victims or deviants, and how can their lives be written with an attention to their expressions of agency and their hunger for beauty and their creation of other forms of living. And so I'm curious both how you approached that task of sort of, I don't even know what language you would use, whether it's like reclaiming lives that have been narrated in those reductive terms or reimagining them, both kind of on a philosophical level, but then also on a, like, where and how did you find the materials with which to imagine those lives or to describe objects that might not have existed?
Yeah, I mean, well, I found these lives because they, you know, they had been captured and they had been enclosed. So I found many of these lives in terms of like prison and reformatory records, the records of social reformers and rent collectors. And I mean, there's this huge effort. I mean, we have, you know, the emergence of sociology. So people are trying to actually document and understand the lives of the poor. So they produce this enormous archive. So there are certain kinds of information available. So how do I use some of that, but to write a very different account of those lives, or what are the things that are contained in a case file that I would never reproduce because of the violence that was a part of the production of a set of facts or description of those lives. I mean, I tell one story about Maddie Jackson, and my description of her and the description of her in the case file, like, it could be more antithetical. And I think that, one of the ways, because the book is very visual, and I do a lot of recounting of photographs because, basically a certain kind of visibility was imposed upon the poor and the working class as their lives were documented. So thinking about those photographs, and there are tens of thousands, probably 100,000, because this was a transatlantic project, and it was the same. And, the UK and France and the US, documenting the lives and of this exactly the same kinds of things, but what it meant to try to restage or break open those photos with a different kind of looking, as well as a critical relationship between those photos and, the photograph that doesn't, appear in the book, but that I describe, which is, Roy de Carava's hallway photograph. And so what does it mean to actually represent that space that is, as it is lived from the inside, as it is space not only of quote unquote deprivation, but that is filled with like emotion and memory and tenderness. So that's what I try to bring to the prevailing set of descriptions, as well as a very active agenda of disordering them, rearranging them,
Yeah, and for the sources that in certain ways you're both using and reading against, the rent collector's notebook or some of the reformatory files, I really loved Maddie Jackson. So maybe we can talk more about her as a particular case study in some of these methods. But like, what does it actually look like for you to read against some of those sources? Like, to what extent does that feel like seeing around their edges? To what extent does that feel like arguing with them or wrestling with them? To what extent is that about imagining the things they don't say?
Yeah, one, the archive is messy. So there's a way, there are also lots of kinds of, there are lots of contradictory statements in a given file. So there was some young woman, melancholy poet and opium addict, who loved going to films, and she would write these things down in her notebook. And she was described as borderline and an idiot, but in the file there's a one-act play and verse that she's written. So on the one hand there's the description based upon the metric, and then there's the one-act play and verse. So what happens if you just kind of like follow that avenue? So I think that that was a lot of what I did, that they're contending descriptions of the life. There's gossip, there's neighbors, there are letters. So I think I just made my way through the mess to figure out the other kinds of stories that might be told.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sometimes there are stories that can be told around certain absences. Like, I'm thinking about Maddie Jackson, and maybe you can just say a little bit about who she was and what story you are telling about her and what stories had been told before this version of her story. But one of the things I was struck by was that there was this sort of lost archive in her story, all these letters that she had written home from Bedford Hills, was it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Where she was incarcerated. And in a sense, like, as a reader and a writer, there's a feeling of heartbreak when you encounter the absence of that archive. Like, right, I wish I could read her letters, but maybe there's something generative about that longing, right? Why do I want them? What is that sort of minor heartbreak of not getting them? And then what are the things that spring up in response to that heartbreak, like wanting to fill in this thing that's not there, but would that be for me or for her, but part of how you navigate that absence is you can also look at the records of, even if you can't read those letters, you're reading the signs of how badly she wanted to write them. Like she was getting these disciplinary infractions for, wanting to get her hands on materials, and that becomes a story, even if there's this sort of absent center that it's happening around.
Right, because in the case of Maddie, I mean, she's punished for having writing materials in her room. And I think that, I think I had a range of materials, and I think, different bodies, and I think I had like 75 files from the reformatory. But of course, we have a subjective relationship to one story or the other. And I think, as soon as I read Maddie's file, I knew that I wanted to write about her. And I think that there were things. I mean, there was such a long memory in her family, so that her mother could tell the story of her grandmother's captivity and passage to Virginia. That was one element. The fact that her parents had traveled. The fact that, after being wayward and after the forces intervened to try to reform her, she became wilder and wilder, and that her mother was actually okay with that and that they were fine. So I thought it was a life where you just, see the violence that's conducted under the label of reform and care. And in the case of Maddie and her mother, it was so much these two black women who were living outside these heteronormative practices, not having, a father in the house. But there was something about the longing, and I was thinking about the expanse and magnitude of Maddie's longing, particularly because of her father, who had been a merchant seaman and who had traveled across so much of the world. Her mother, her mother had been educated in New York when she was younger. So there were so many things about her life, as well as her very, frontal disregard for property and who owned what. So she wasn't, she's not an uncomplicated innocent. She's like a messy figure. And so that messiness, I mean, there were kind of good girls who had gone wrong and, were reformed, but I wasn't really interested in those lives. I wanted to write about those who were, deeply and truly wayward, and Maddie was one of them.
Yeah, well, when you talk about the violence done under the auspices of reform, I mean, I think a lot of violence has been done under the auspices of the word innocent, too. The idea that the innocent are the ones who among us is innocent at all, but that the innocent are the ones who deserve care or rehabilitation, or, so to think about Wayward Lives in a different sense feels useful in terms of destabilizing that idea of the innocent as the worthies.
Yeah, and I think that what's also so, particular about, waywardness is that it's like a status crime. It's not really a crime, but your behavior is criminalized if you're a certain kind of person. And so the wayward, they weren't juvenile delinquents, because even a juvenile delinquent commits an act that if adult committed it would be considered a crime. That's not true of waywardness. It's a status offense, and it was another way in which a kind of racialized order came into being. And I guess a really disturbing part of this, story of waywardness is that so many of the reformers and the women involved in, like, you know, constructing the reformatories, they were people who had been leftists, who had been feminists. Many of them were the first generation of, you know, women to get their PhDs in sociology and political economy from Chicago. So the first head of, like, you know, the Bedford Hills Reformatory actually, you know, had, you know, she'd reviewed Du Bois's work. She was a quote-unquote progressive. At one point she had been a Marxist, but yet she's involved in the work of creating, you know, the carceral system. And early on, they knew that, oh, the reformatory isn't actually helping and reforming anyone. And in fact, what it means is that the kind of the life chances and opportunities of these young women become radically restricted, you know, after this experience. But yet there's a commitment to that project because there's a commitment to policing, you know, the lives of young women.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I wonder, I mean, in thinking about the kinds of questions that you've been articulating around the desire and the kind of narrative hunger to do justice to the ways in which the woman who was called an idiot was actually writing these beautiful reflections or writing a one-act play in verse, or the way in which Maddie could get narrated by reformers as in terms of her promiscuity, but like within that promiscuity was a certain form of rebellion and a deep longing. It seems like there's such a powerful, and you feel this as a reader, I think, in the book, like an emotional and ethical charge to those narrations. And then I wonder what the forces are, or if there are forces that kind of push back against how much, like, of all the things that are left off the record, what it means to imagine things that aren't there, or whether you feel certain limits in how much you can imagine of a subject's interiority from the past. Like, when is that a kind of recuperation, and then when is it a kind of assumption or violation?
That's the difficult question. That, you know, and it's a critically important one. I mean, I think that because the therapeutic state is producing a profile of each, you know, each subject. And so there's a lot of information about, in the files, like, you know, what they dream, where they grew up. So there is that. I mean, but what I also think a huge part of the speculative labor of the book is just like a kind of like a radical reimagining of what their aspirations and wants and desires are, you know? I mean, and for me, you know, W.B. Du Bois's like Black Reconstruction stands as a kind of model. I mean, Du Bois was able to write this radical history of Reconstruction where he imagined the enslaved as radical actors. Du Bois didn't have one piece of evidence that most mainstream historians who thought Reconstruction was a nightmare had. He was working with exactly the same material they had. He had a radically different imagination of what was possible, right? Of who they were as actors, of what they wanted. And I feel like a lot of what I brought to the book is just that, an understanding of what those kind of aspirations are, what those desires are for a different kind of order in which one might thrive. What would it be to kind of to be in a world that wasn't against you, and what do you do in the meantime? How do you create a space to breathe? And I think that that's a radically different framework than one that, you know, would see these young women as always already criminalized, always already a problem. So once that is the frame of it, a different kind of story unfolds. But I think that your point about when is, I mean, you know, when does it feel like a violation, and when does it feel like it enables something? And for me, that is a deeply ethical question. I mean, I think that in the writing, I mean, when I am in the space of imagining. I am in the space of imagining Maddie having this kind of intimate experience of embodiment. And I think, so many of the records of the documents say, Black women were tired of being the maids and servants of the world. They were tired of being the mules of the world. So what might it be like to have an embodiment that's pleasurable? And what might it be like to be a Black woman reading about the experience of someone in an embodiment? And for me, that seemed like it was so that it's, there's a notice to the reader, but that's something that we need to imagine, the possibility of a non-violated embodiment, the possibility that, what we want might actually matter. So in that, it felt important to have that on the page.
Yeah, and it's beautiful to hear you speak about it here, and to think about those ways that beauty and possibility can and need to importantly be found in stories that have been told as stories of victimization, or stories of, not just deviance, but stories of pain. And I was wondering, in a few minutes we'll open it up. I'm sure there's so many questions from people who are here. But I wonder if you would be willing to read a short passage about beauty that I think, to me at least, speaks to a lot of these ideas from 33. It's
Okay.
maybe just that one paragraph.
Okay, and 33, okay. Okay, so, I followed her? Okay, yeah. I followed her from Philadelphia to New York, the largest Black cities in the North, stumbling through the streets of the 7th Ward and then onto the Tenderloin, and after that Harlem. I spotted her everywhere, on the corner, in the cabaret, on the boardwalk at Coney Island, in the chorus. Sometimes I failed to notice her. At other times, the headliners and the celebrities overshadowed her when she was allowed among their company. She bore faint resemblance to the girl I first encountered, and had I not known about the attic, or that she had been forced to sleep in a coal bin, or that she was raped by her uncle, or assaulted by a neighbor, or brutalized by her employer, I would have never guessed from looking at her. It was an age when Negroes were the most beautiful people, and this was no less true of her. Even her detractors reluctantly admitted as much. It's hard to explain what's beautiful about a rather ordinary colored girl of no exceptional talents, a face difficult to discern in the crowd, an average Corinne not destined to be a star, or even the heroine of a feminist plot. In some regard, it is to recognize the obvious, but that which is reluctantly seated, the beauty of the Black ordinary, the beauty that resides in and animates the determination to live free, the beauty that propels the experiments in living otherwise. It encompasses the extraordinary and the mundane, art and everyday use. Beauty is not a luxury. Rather, it is a way of creating possibility in the space of enclosure, a radical art of subsistence, an embrace of our terribleness, a transfiguration of the given. It is a will to adorn, a proclivity for the Baroque, and the love of too much.
Thank you. I think there's so much that really moves me in that passage, but the idea both The beauty of the Black ordinary, the beauty that resides in and animates the determination to live free, the beauty that propels the experiments in living otherwise, feels so close to the core of this book, as does the idea that beauty is not a luxury, rather it is a way of creating possibility in the space of enclosure. And even that idea of beauty as possibility in the space of enclosure really resonates through that first passage that you read aloud to me, where you talk about the kind of the brutality and the terribleness of certain spaces, but also the fact that they're the site of intimacy and the site of living and the site of kissing and the site of love and the site of being with your friends. And I wonder how that idea sort of moved you through the project of this book, the idea that beauty is not a luxury, but a creation of possibility within enclosure. How is that sort of working its way through this project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are two, processes that are happening simultaneously, and one is the making of a new racial order in the aftermath of the end of slavery, and in the North. I mean, I'm writing about New York and Philadelphia. This isn't a story of Mississippi and South Carolina, right? So how is it that, educated young Black women come to New York and they find that the only opportunity available for them is domestic work, and we're beginning to see, the making of these kind of exclusive racialized zones in the organization of urban space. So that is happening, and that is this brutal process. And yet, in the context of that enclosure, people are still required to figure out how they are going to live, right? How they're going to make it. And I think, in an anti-Black world, kind of self-love is this incredibly radical act. And I remember when I was finishing the book, and it was the summer of 2016, 2017, and it was like every 2 days there would be some new, viral record of a police killing. And, at that moment I thought, I'm someone who's, been around, as I said, for half a century, and I thought, oh my God, I'm actually not gonna live to see the end of racism in my lifetime. Like it was very, just clear and visceral, like, oh my God, I'll never see an end to this. And I thought, oh, but that's not a novel thought. Like that's how it was for my grandmother and for them. And so then but that recognition made even more important just the ways, the practices of the everyday life, and the effort to create alternative, albeit short-lived, social arrangements that the intensity of that brutality, that dispossession, makes even greater the hunger for beauty, for love, for tenderness.
Yeah, and I think there's part of what's so forceful about this book is the way that it is both enacting and asking from us, its readers, a kind of vision that can include both, can see the terribleness and the beauty, and to not have one visible at the exclusion or to the exclusion of the other.
Yeah, and I mean, and I just, because certainly like that terribleness, and which is also, I mean, the poet Amiri Baraka has this wonderful book called like In Our Terribleness, and that kind of terribleness is the same as our beauty. We are terrible. So, and I think that seeming, paradox or irony is precisely about what it means to live in a situation that is in so many ways uninhabitable, unlivable, but yet we have and we do.
I'm going to ask one more question, although I have 1,000 more that I could ask, but after that we'll turn it over to the room because I know that there are so many questions from other people here. And this question, it connects, I think, to what you were saying about some of what was happening in the world, and what you were bearing witness to and what was happening inside of you as you were bearing witness to those acts of violence and the completion of this book. And I'm curious how the project of this book fits into your longer project of engaging with various kinds of archives and narrating the lives of people who have experienced various kinds of violence. And I'm thinking, I had mentioned to you earlier, when we talked about this book in the fall, my seminar also talked about a really wonderful essay you wrote called Venus in Two Acts, which I can't do justice to all of what it's doing, but some of what it's doing is thinking about certain archives of the Middle Passage and how they reinscribe certain kinds of violence. Actually, when you were talking about the excess of materials that were available to you in this book, I was thinking about how you talk about excess in the archives of the Middle Passage, the excess of violence and tallies, and that there's a brutality to that excess. But in that project, in that essay, you talk about the temptation. You say the loss of stories sharpens the hunger for them, so it is tempting to fill in the gaps and to provide closure where there is none. And you actually dramatize at several points in the essay a sort of desire to fill in certain gaps, to, in one case, imagine a possible friendship between two girls who died. And then you kind of cut yourself off sometimes from those acts of imagining and say, who would that imagining be for, wondering who it would be for. And so I wonder whether you have felt a kind of shift or an evolution in your relationship to both writing about lives implicated and damaged by violence, but also the acts of speculation and imagination, whether you relate to those acts differently than you used to, or whether you think they maybe manifest or ethically should manifest differently in relation to different histories, in relation to, say, the Middle Passage versus these lives in early 20th century urban spaces, sort of how that part of you, that impulse to imagine, sort of has moved through time.
Yes, all of that. I think, with Venus in Two Acts, I was really thinking about a particular a chapter in Lose Your Mother called The Dead Book, and a relationship between two girls who had both been murdered on a slave ship at the hand of a captain. And I guess for me the tension was, Black suffering is often represented as a site of redemption for others, right? Or like, oh, they went through that, but they're fine on the other side, or that there's a kind of romance of resilience that lets people off the hook, And so I was very much like, I'm not writing anything like that. And I actually felt that in the context of slavery, that I really had to bring a certain structural violence into view that I thought hadn't been named at all. And with the girls, I'm walking this line between, like, what I wanted for them is I wanted them to have one another on the ship. I wanted them to have that comfort. And then I thought, but is that a romance for me? So that in this, and dealing with, the violence of the trade, that there would be this moment of comfort, this little like escape route. And I'm also trained, we have our training. And so there's, you can only go so far in how you work with archival materials before you land in a space called fiction. And I was concerned with respecting that archival limit, but the essay kind of closes raising with a question like, but what's the cost of respecting that limit, particularly when we understand that these are documents of power, that the archive itself is filled with like lies and excesses? Does it mean that then we're perpetually, consigned to this order of statements. So I just thought, like, fidelity for whom, to what end, and I think that's something that also, that I was sort of, there's only one way to witness a scene. I mean, there are many kinds of looks. So there may be the look of, a kind of voyeur at the spectacle of Black Death. But then there are the mourners, and there are the circles, and there are the lamenters. And I was thinking, like, oh, so there are many more possibilities of looking. It's not only defined by one dominant axis. And then just thinking about the sonic is as important for me in the book, and thinking about the space of multiple and collective utterance that's already there, and what about, if I use that to also build out story, to build out what I can say. So those things, those thoughts marked a shift that enabled me to do things that I wasn't able to do, and it was also a very different kind of archival source than the transatlantic slave trade materials.
What you just said gave me 16 more questions that I wanted to ask, but I do want to open it up to the room, to others who have questions out there, and I think there's a mic coming around.
Thank you. I was thinking about this notion of what you had written about the possibility of dispossession, and that still rings true with this latest work. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And
what particular, are you thinking of a particular former work, or just like?
A former work. Mm-hmm. Losing your mom, mm-hmm. losing your mother.
Yeah,
my bad.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So again, that seems to be a recurring theme, even with this latest piece in terms of Wayward Lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that dispossessive state is the prevailing condition, and I think, but still things unfold. I mean, today in my class, I was teaching Sylvia Wynter, and I was teaching a brilliant unpublished manuscript. It was like 992 pages, and I was joking with my students, only a woman could produce a brilliant 992-page manuscript that has never been published. But one of the things, Wynter talks about is she talks about the way that there's metamorphosis in double senses. Like there's the metamorphosis of the enslaved African who becomes an utter commodity. And then there's the metamorphosis that's involved in making oneself human again. And so I feel like that's the line that I'm always trying to walk, to really to give rich, textured, rigorous account of the forces that make life so impossible, that make our lives disposable, precarious, fungible. And at the same time, what meets that force, right? In terms of the imagination of freedom, in terms of practices of care, of mutual aid, of love, of imagining something that is not this. What the thought of the outside that is the response to dispossession. I feel like I've been just walking that line in all of the books, so, yeah.
I know there was a up here.
Hi. What you were saying about the archives resonated with me because I'm a writer of historical fiction, and I'm writing about the slave trade as well. And, encountering some of the same issues. But I think, obviously, with fiction, you have liberty to go there. But at the same time, wanting to be responsible and not kind of recreate or create new stereotypes and biases and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just curious to know, I mean, obviously, you're an academician. And when you're an academician, there are certain rules and guidelines that you have to follow, but I'm curious to know if ever there are impulses that you might feel are, let's say, spiritual, or maybe you're thinking about human nature, and how someone might have reacted because they were a human being, and you're a human being with emotions. I know myself, when I was kind of inventing scenes, I would say, well, what would a person do in this situation? And sometimes I'm like, oh, I just made this up. And people say, oh, like, where'd you get this from? This sounds so authentic. I'm like, I just made that up. And sometimes I would actually find it later in the records. So I'm just curious to know if you've had those experiences and how you navigate that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, a principle, and this is about ethical engagement, is like, do no harm. So do no harm to those I'm writing about. And for, with this book, I mean, there's a kind of, and someone actually described this as a work of speculative nonfiction, which I kind of liked as, one description of it. I think that I work from, those materials, but then how I also build story is through my embodiment. I mean, it's just like with Lose Your Mother, writing about the experience of that young girl who was murdered aboard the slave ship. I mean, I don't even have her name. I have the 4 words, the said Negro girl. So in order to build any story from her, I had to think about the experience of that body in the world, what happens to a body after 28 days of starvation. I read studies of hunger in the Warsaw Ghetto, like that, there were, or hanging. So you do all of this research that helps you build out story, thinking about a very particular moment or situation. So I'm probably more, restricted than you are, but there's still, I had to imagine Maddie in a room having a sexual encounter. I mean, I knew she had them. I knew she had them with this person. So there was just that outline. But what did it mean for her to be there? And so that's so it was a speculation.
Hi. So I recently reread the section with Helen Parrish and Mamie Sharp and James Shepard. And there's the scene where Helen is watching the scene between Mamie and her husband, James. And it's beautiful and heartbreaking because they are having this intimate moment in front of Helen. And she's trying, and it's written from Helen's perspective. And so as a reader, I'm desperately trying to understand what's happening between the two of them. And then it's also heartbreaking because Mamie can't express what she needs to express, and James can't express what he needs to express because they're being watched by this performer and their landlord. And what you just said about things being unknowable, is that different from, understanding that there is a form of intimacy that we can't, unless you are inside of it, you can't cross. Or I guess the better question is do, as you're going through Helen's letters and you are recreating that scene, do you know what Mamie is trying to express? Do you know what James wants to hear? It's a really beautiful passage, and I keep going back to it because there's a friend once said that there's a part of Blackness that is unknowable, and it's not because of lack of depth, but that because so much of our lives are on public view, that we just we have developed essentially a way of living, but that we can hide in public view.
Yeah, I mean that's a I think that, you know, that section you're talking about, I mean, Helen Parrish is a white reformer in Philadelphia, and she's a very problematic figure. I mean, part of, but what's amazing to me about Helen is, again, like the recording of what is this like very beautiful exchange that happens between them. So for me, that then became the basis of the scene where there's an economy of withholding that's going on, right? And it's really like, I mean, the reformer, because of her desires, investment, and Mamie really wants to bring her under control. So it's this just really beautiful kind of drama about love. And so there's what they say, what Helen has recorded, and then there's all the things that they might have said or might say if they weren't in her view. And so I wanted the reader to feel what is not being said, as well as what's, you know, there on the page. So I'm glad you felt that in this kind of intense, you know, parlor scene between that that trio of characters, and for me that's also one of the things. I mean, I think I do love archives, you know, because one of the things is, you know, like a figure like Helen, who's, you know, a total mess, but then she's also conscious enough to write down all the ways that she is like totally messing things up, and to actually to give voice to the way her Black tenants, you know, call her out, refuse to be under her control, and her trespasses. And so for me, it's like finding a moment in time to encounter that as an object, and to want those people to have life again, and, you know, on that page. But that's one of the scenes in the book that I too love, that scene with them.
Hello.
Hi.
So I have been extremely fascinated with the idea of vestibularity. Mm-hmm. And the first passage that you read reminded me of a passage in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe by Spillers. And if I could just read a piece of it. Mm-hmm. So it says, the undecipherable markings on the captive body render a kind of hieroglyphics of the flesh whose severe disjuncture come to be hidden to the cultural seeings by skin color. We might well ask if this phenomenon of marking and branding actually transfer from one generation to another, finding its various symbolic substitutions in an efficacy of meanings that repeat the initial moments. And later on in that passage, she says, punctures of the flesh create the distance between what I would designate a cultural vestibularity and the culture. And so for me, she really refers to like this conduit, right? This metaphorical conduit between what I interpret as like the remnants of like Black legacy, and this other place that we have to exist to be a part of culture. And so that also speaks somewhat to dispossession, which has come up a couple times. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts when it comes to vestibularity physically in what you described, and just metaphorically from what she's kind of bringing out in that passage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that wonderful, brilliant essay by Hortense Spillers, you know, it's not unlike Winter talking about metamorphoses. I mean, there's a way that Spillers is talking about flesh against body. Like the subject has a body, right? The subject has a culture, the subject has property, and then there's this flesh, which is about both about a violent theft and a violence that's done to, Black being in the world, but that flesh perhaps opens up a new vocabulary for being, and so I think for Spillers, that the flesh is, a kind of a blueprint for the social otherwise. In that essay, she's thinking particularly about Black flesh as being ungendered, right? It being marked and ungendered. And at the end of it, she says, well, that the desire is not to fit into the category of woman, but for, the longing for a more insurgent social ground. And again, that's about what dispossession can yield, right? If the subject is all like, I think, I am, I own, I kill, I fence. I mean, maybe we don't want to line up with those order of values that define the subject. So what does it mean then to have this intimacy with other forms of living, right? To have a different relationship to earth, to soil, to other orders of life than that is, the norm for a certain kind of propertied Western man in the world. So I think it's that dispossession might open up another grammar of being.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for these thoughts. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Saidiya and Leslie. There'll be a brief book signing, and again, next week, 2 weeks, we'll be here with Mitchell Jackson and Monty Perry to discuss his book, Survival Math, and hopefully you guys will be here. Thank you for coming.
Couple notes, folks. There may be a lot of you who have books. If you wouldn't mind.